My name was Samuel Hutchins. At 32, I took a man's life, and with it, I took away my own future. The judge handed down a sentence that felt like eternity. 40 years. The newspapers called me a monster. I accepted the word and carried it like a brand, every single day, behind bars. Now I am 72. I breathe the air of freedom again, but I do not know if forgiveness exists for someone like me, because I am still my own judge, and my sentence has never truly ended. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Samuel Hutchins. I was 72 years old the morning I stood at the edge of the compound, staring at the rusted iron gates of FCI Allenwood Low in Pennsylvania. The guards didn't say much. They rarely did at releases. One of them held a clipboard. The other had his thumb hovering over a plastic button that controlled the gate mechanism. It groaned with a tired, mechanical cough, like a dying animal, then began to slide open. I didn't move right away. My legs didn't know the meaning of that sound anymore. I had heard it from the inside thousands of times, but this time, it wasn't followed by shackles or orders. It was just air and metal, and something that felt too wide to be real. In my right hand, I held a translucent plastic pouch. Inside was the life I'd arrived with: a cracked leather belt, a Timex wristwatch that hadn't ticked in decades, and a Pennsylvania driver's license that had expired during the Reagan administration. The belt was 2 holes too tight now. My body had softened, shrunk even, in ways I hadn't fully understood until I tried to breathe freely again. The watch's glass was scratched like frost on a winter windshield, the band stiff and peeling. I turned it over in my hand. My name was still engraved faintly on the back, like a whisper from a man I no longer knew. The guard nodded to me, a gesture more mechanical than human. That was the moment. I stepped forward, 1 foot, then the next, past the boundary where the prison's shadow stopped. My shoes, state-issued and uncomfortably tight, made a strange sound on the concrete, like I was walking across someone else's memory. The sun was just rising. Pale orange light touched the trees beyond the parking lot. There was a smell I hadn't felt in years: fresh-cut grass, gasoline from a maintenance truck, the faint sweetness of early morning dew clinging to the metal railing. It all hit me at once, a flood of sensation too big for the body I now lived in. My back ached. My right shoulder, torn decades ago in a scuffle, crackled with stiffness. I didn't own a phone, a wallet, or a home. All I carried was the weight of years and a folded piece of paper in my shirt pocket, the number of a halfway house that didn't know I was coming. Outside the gate, the asphalt shimmered faintly with heat, though it was barely 8 a.m. A blackbird watched me from a lamppost, its head cocked sideways, as if confused by my presence. I looked back over my shoulder. The prison stood silent, its windows blank and mirrored. A concrete box full of ghosts. The van that was supposed to pick me up hadn't arrived. I didn't mind. I wasn't in a rush to meet the world that had forgotten me. I walked to the edge of the parking lot, sat on the low concrete barrier, and placed the pouch beside me. The bench was cold and dusty. I brushed it with the sleeve of my shirt, a habit I hadn't lost. In prison, you cleaned what you touched. It was a matter of respect, of routine, of maintaining a sense of control where there was none. I opened the pouch and took out the watch. I tried to strap it on, but my fingers fumbled. The leather cracked under pressure. Still, I managed to fasten it. The watch didn't work. It hadn't in years, but wearing it made me feel less hollow. Time had moved on without me. But the weight of that object on my wrist reminded me that I had once been someone with places to be. It was absurd, in a way, but comforting. The pouch also held a faded photograph. It had curled at the edges, yellowed with years. A boy on a swing. My son. taken before everything. I looked at it for a long while, squinting in the morning light, letting my thumb trace the corner where a crease had split the image. He would be a grown man now, older than I had been when I was locked away. I didn't know what he looked like anymore, didn't know if he remembered the swing or the man behind the camera. My stomach growled. 40 years of institutional meals had trained it to expect food at fixed hours. Breakfast had been at 6. I had eaten a hard-boiled egg, 2 slices of cold toast, and lukewarm coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. Now, there was nothing. I reached into my pocket for the $20 bill they'd given me. It was wrinkled, almost foreign in my hand. Paper money had changed, like everything else. A bus passed on the highway beyond the trees. I watched it go, a streak of color and motion that felt impossibly fast. People inside, with headphones, newspapers, phones, lives. I wondered what they would think if they knew who I was. Not just a man, a killer, a number, an entry in an old newspaper. Would they shift in their seats, lower their eyes, or just not care at all? A breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of lilacs. There had been lilac bushes outside the courthouse in 1983. I remembered them in bloom the day I was sentenced. The irony wasn't lost on me, that something so delicate could exist beside something so final. Even now, the smell reached inside my chest like a whisper of the past, soft and cruel. I closed the pouch, holding it in my lap like it was sacred. For a moment I sat still, listening. No keys rattling, no boots on concrete, no voices yelling count numbers or cell assignments. Just the wind, the birds, and the distant hum of life moving forward. That was my first breath of the outside world, and already it felt heavier than the one I had left. The air outside the prison smelled like something I hadn't known in decades. Movement. It carried the scent of distant cooking oil, of hot pavement, of something green and breathing. It was thin and vast at the same time, like I had stepped into a space too large for my lungs to handle. I breathed in slowly, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't recycled through vents or tainted by industrial bleach. It was real. It unsettled me. The halfway house was 23 miles away. I had memorized the address on the paper they gave me, though I didn't trust my memory anymore. Numbers used to stick like glue. Cell blocks, inmate IDs, time schedules. But lately they slipped. I walked to the nearest bus stop, clutching the plastic pouch they'd handed me like it might fall apart. My legs were stiff, my knees clicked, my back protested every step. But I kept walking, like a wind-up toy still moving because no one had turned the key back yet. At the bus shelter, a teenager sat hunched over a glowing screen. White cords dangled from his ears. His face never lifted. I stood 3 feet away, and I may as well have been invisible. In a way, I was grateful. The last thing I wanted was to be seen, not just looked at, but recognized. The name Samuel Hutchins had lived in newspapers, in legal records, in memories of people who had every right to forget. I didn't want to intrude on anyone's present. I had already done enough damage in the past. The bench was metal, covered in old gum and scratches. I didn't sit. I was too used to standing in lines, waiting for a voice to command me. I shifted my weight and listened to the sounds around me. Cars passing, birds chirping, a dog barking somewhere across the street. There was a kind of chaos to it, but not the kind I had known. Not the clang of gates, the slam of fists, or the dry buzz of overhead lights that never turned off. The bus came late. When the doors hissed open, I climbed the steps slowly. My knees hated the incline. I showed the driver my $20 bill. He pointed at the machine. I tried to feed the bill into the slot, but it spat it out again and again. My fingers shook. The machine beeped impatiently. I heard someone sigh behind me. The driver took the bill finally, punched a few buttons, and handed me a handful of coins and a card. I nodded in thanks, my throat too dry to speak. I took a seat near the back. I chose the window side, needing the barrier. I pressed my pouch to my chest, as if someone might take it from me. Outside, the world moved like a silent film reel. A woman jogging, children in a crosswalk, a man hosing down the sidewalk in front of a barber shop. All of it looked like memory, like pieces of a life I had once watched but never lived. The buildings were shorter than I remembered. Or maybe I had grown taller in confinement, my senses stretched, sharpened by repetition and denial. Color overwhelmed me. Greens too green, reds too loud. The brightness of a billboard advertising some phone I didn't recognize made me squint. There were faces on every ad, smiling, perfect, young. I felt like I was passing through someone else's dream. My reflection in the bus window stared back. Sunken cheeks, a liver spot near my left eye, eyebrows like wiry brush. I barely knew him. We passed a bakery. The smell of warm bread struck like a blow to the chest. In prison, bread came in pre-sliced plastic bags, always cold, sometimes moldy. This scent, yeast, sugar, something almost buttery, was like a whisper from a life I'd forgotten I had. For a second, I saw my mother's hands, dusted in flour, the kitchen table cluttered with bowls. But the bus turned the corner, and the memory vanished as quickly as it came. At the next stop, a woman boarded with a stroller. I stood automatically to offer my seat. It was a reflex, hardwired into me from decades of navigating space with dangerous men. Always give up the corner, always reduce the threat. But she didn't look at me. She turned her stroller, settled in without a glance. I stood there awkwardly until a man behind me said something under his breath. I sat back down. My body tensed, unsure if I had broken some new unwritten rule. My hands went to the pouch again. I unzipped it and pulled out the watch. It still didn't work. I wound it anyway, listening for a tick that never came. The act calmed me. It gave my fingers purpose. In the silence of my section of the bus, the strap rasped softly against my wrist. That sound, small and private, reminded me of the morning routines I'd built in my cell. Wake, stretch, wash face, sit, wind watch. Even when time stopped, I went through the motions. It wasn't hope. It was rhythm. Ritual. The only thing that couldn't be taken away. We passed a school. Children poured onto the sidewalk, backpacks bouncing, voices high and wild. I stared. Their movement was unchained, disorderly, free. I felt like I was watching a species I no longer belonged to. There was a fence around the playground. I noticed the irony before I could stop myself. When we reached my stop, I rose too quickly. My legs buckled slightly, but I caught myself on the seat back. I stepped off the bus, and the heat hit me harder than I expected. The pavement radiated upward. My shoes weren't meant for walking. They were meant for processing out, for one symbolic march into society. The soles were too thin. Every pebble pressed into my feet like a reminder. The halfway house stood on a quiet street. It was a 2-story brick structure with peeling shutters and a rusting railing. The door had a keypad. I didn't know the code. I knocked. No one answered. I sat on the front step and waited. A cicada buzzed in a tree above me, its sound grinding against my eardrums. I pulled the pouch into my lap again and stared at the cracked watch face. The second hand hadn't moved. A truck passed, kicking up dust. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler clicked to life. The water arced across a trimmed lawn. That smell, wet grass in summer, filled the air. It was the scent of youth, of long-forgotten July afternoons, of front porches and bare feet. It stung behind my eyes. I pressed my hand flat against the concrete step. It was warm, real, steady. I was out. I was breathing. But the question that haunted me wasn't about freedom. It was about purpose. I had no one waiting, no job, no family that claimed me, no role in this world other than to occupy space as quietly as possible. And yet I breathed. The air was too big, too sharp, too sweet. It cut me open in places I didn't know were still bleeding, but I took it in again, deeper this time. Not because I deserved it, but because it was all I had. That was my first breath of freedom, and it didn't taste like victory. It tasted like dust, memory, and the slow unraveling of a life once locked behind steel. The first time I saw my name again in public print, it was on the back page of a newspaper left behind on a park bench. The paper was creased and stained with coffee, the top corner curling from the wind. I hadn't gone looking for it. I had simply sat down on that bench because my knees hurt, and the heat was pressing into my spine like a slab of iron. I remember brushing away the crumbs beside me before I noticed the photo. It was small, grainy, probably taken decades ago, because I barely recognized myself. The headline read, "Convicted Killer Released After 40 Years." My name was bold and unflinching, as though time hadn't softened it. I stared at the letters. Samuel Hutchins. There it was, carved into ink, laid bare for the public again. The rest of the article summarized my entire life in 3 paragraphs. Age, crime, release date, a quote from the DA's office about public concern and monitoring. There was no mention of who I had been before or what had happened after. They had chosen the worst photo they could find. In it, I looked hard and cold. Prison had just begun then, and I still wore the face of someone clenching every muscle to survive. My eyes had no patience for softness, no room for reflection. I studied that face, trying to find traces of the man I now carried inside me. But all I could see was the shell I had constructed to keep myself alive in a world of concrete and routine. I folded the paper shut, but my name kept echoing in my skull. The words curled around my ribs like a belt cinched too tight. It wasn't that I had expected anonymity. I knew the world didn't forget men like me. But there was something different about seeing yourself reduced to a headline. Your past served cold to strangers drinking coffee and flipping pages between the sports scores and the weather forecast. The smell of the newsprint lingered on my fingers. Ink, cheap pulp, a faint sourness from someone's spilled drink. That smell pulled me back to the prison library, where old newspapers were stacked in uneven towers and left to yellow in the corners. I used to read them slowly, one line at a time, imagining what it felt like to live in the world outside. Now, here I was, on the outside, and the pages still held me hostage. I watched people pass. No one looked at me. No one knew that the man from the article was sitting 2 feet from the paper. A jogger bounced by, her earbuds glowing white. A father wheeled a stroller, humming under his breath. The world wasn't watching me. It was moving on. But the paper stayed there like a tombstone in my lap, reminding me that forgetting and forgiving were 2 very different things. The bench was worn, the paint peeling from the slats. I ran my fingers over one of the carved initials, T+S 1998, and wondered if those 2 people were still together, or if time had erased them too. 40 years was long enough to lose everything, long enough for the world to change currency, change presidents, change morals, but not long enough to change a name. Later that afternoon, I walked into a corner store to buy a bottle of water. The clerk was reading a copy of the same paper behind the counter. I paused when I saw the back page again. The same photo, the same story. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. My throat tightened, but I kept walking. I took the water from the cooler, paid in cash, and didn't say a word. On the way out, I glanced at the newspaper racks. My face looked back at me from behind plastic wrap. 5 different copies. 5 identical truths. To the world, I was news again. Not because of who I had become, but because of who I had once been. A story people would read, and then forget, until the next crime, the next headline, the next man they could point at and label. That night, I sat in my small room at the halfway house and laid the newspaper flat on the table. I didn't read the article again. I just stared at the typography, the shape of my name in bold. I had spent years trying not to say it too often in prison. Too much attention, too many memories. But now that it was public again, I couldn't stop hearing it. Like a drumbeat echoing through a canyon I couldn't leave. I took out my old watch from the pouch. Still broken, still mute. I set it on the table beside the paper and lined them up, as if trying to measure the weight of time against the permanence of reputation. The watch had once belonged to my father. He gave it to me when I turned 18, before I enlisted. He told me a man needed something reliable to measure himself against. The irony was bitter now. The watch had stopped years ago, but the name ticked on in ink, in court files, in articles, in memory. I stared at that front page until the daylight faded. I didn't turn on the lamp. I let the shadows stretch and fill the room. The newspaper turned gray, then black, but I could still see my name burned into it, even in the dark. When I finally folded the page and slid it into the drawer beside my bed, I did it slowly, like laying a body to rest. My hand lingered on the edge of the drawer before closing it. The sound of the wood scraping shut reminded me of a cell door. I sat there long after, my hands open on my knees, the smell of ink still clinging to my skin. I knew then that no matter how quietly I lived now, the name in that paper had already spoken for me, and it would keep speaking long after I was gone. The street was narrower than I remembered. The asphalt had cracks like dry skin, and the sidewalks were chipped and uneven. I walked slowly, counting the mailboxes, tracing the numbers carved into the wood, like they were coordinates to a memory. There was a time I could have walked it blindfolded. Now every step felt like a guess. When I saw the house, or what used to be the house, my breath caught without warning. It wasn't there. In its place stood a smooth slab of new pavement, a clean parking lot with white lines and reserved signs. A bank branch had replaced my childhood. Where there had once been a porch swing, there was now an ATM. The lilac bushes that had bloomed every spring beneath my mother's window were gone, replaced with trimmed shrubs in identical shapes, all sterile and foreign. I crossed the street and stood on the sidewalk, staring. My feet refused to move any closer. I didn't want to stand on that concrete. I didn't want to step where the kitchen had been, where I'd snuck peanut butter from the jar at midnight, or listen to the muffled voices of my parents arguing softly over bills. The ghosts in my head didn't know what to do with the absence. The sky was overcast, the kind of dull gray that sucked the color out of everything. I looked up, half expecting to see the familiar slant of the old roof, the patch Dad had repaired himself with leftover shingles from a neighbor. But the sky was empty. The house had vanished without even a marker. I sat on the curb and pulled the pouch from my coat. My fingers dug until I found the folded photograph. My parents in front of the house, standing stiffly, arms brushing. My mother's apron was still on, my father's sleeves rolled up from working in the garden. Behind them, the porch steps leaned slightly to one side, and the screen door hung crooked. I used to hate that it squeaked. Now I missed the sound like it was a piece of my own body. The photo trembled in my hands, not from emotion, but from the fine tremor that had begun years ago in my wrists. I folded it back up carefully, like something fragile, and returned it to the pouch. A truck passed behind me, blasting music I didn't recognize. The bass shook the pavement beneath me. I didn't turn. I just sat there, watching the building that stood on the grave of my old life. I stayed until the wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to fall. They tapped on the sidewalk like a slow-ticking clock. I pulled my collar up, but didn't move. Water collected at the base of the curb and began to darken the street. The white lines of the parking lot blurred in the wet, and for a moment I imagined the outline of the front steps returning, like a phantom surfacing through ink. Eventually I stood. My knees resisted. I walked around the block, tracing the edges of what used to be mine. At the back, I found the alley still intact, narrower and darker than before, but recognizable. A rusted pipe still jutted out from the brick wall where our hose had connected. I placed my hand on it. It was cold and slick with rain. I closed my eyes and remembered rinsing mud from my shoes there, listening to my father yell from inside about wasting water. That pipe was all that remained. I walked further, to the lot where the grocery store had been. It was gone too. Now a sleek pharmacy with mirrored windows and automatic doors. Inside, shelves gleamed with rows of vitamins and skin cream. I didn't go in. I stood beneath the awning as the rain turned steady, soaking my coat. I watched a young woman with a toddler emerge, the boy giggling as he stomped in a puddle. She scolded him softly, but smiled as she wiped his shoes on the mat. Their laughter floated toward me. I turned my head and looked away. That night, in my room, I spread the pouch contents on the table like relics. The broken watch, the photo, the old key I'd kept for reasons I couldn't explain. It was heavy and brass, worn smooth by years of pockets. It used to open the front door. Now it opened nothing. Still, I couldn't let it go. I held the key in my palm and thought about doors that no longer existed, about the scent of baking bread in the kitchen, about my mother humming in the hallway, about the worn dip in the stairs where I used to jump 2 steps at a time. In prison, I'd always imagined coming home. I had replayed the walk from the corner, the feel of the doorknob, the sound of the creaking floor. I had imagined the way light filtered through the living room curtains, the way the wood smelled in summer. But there was no home to return to. Only the hollow echo of those imagined footsteps and a parking lot painted over memory. I turned off the light and lay on the cot. The rain tapped against the window, steady and indifferent. I held the key in my hand until sleep came, its cold teeth pressing into my skin, reminding me that not every lock had something left behind it. The first night back in a real bed wasn't restful. It was quiet. Yes, too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed into your ears and amplified every shift in your breathing, every creak in the wood frame beneath you. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the halfway house room, its off-white paint flaking in one corner like peeling bark. The mattress sagged in the middle and smelled faintly of disinfectant and cigarette smoke. I didn't move. I just let the hours pass across my skin, 1 second after another, each heavier than the last. Somewhere in the hallway, a radiator knocked. It was a dull, rhythmic sound, but even that was enough to make me flinch. I had spent too long in a place where unexpected noises could mean violence or a new order that changed the rhythm of your day without warning. I lay still, muscles tense, waiting for the old voices that usually followed such sounds, but none came. Just the wind brushing against the window pane and the soft hum of the building settling around me. I turned my head and saw the red numbers of the clock radio glowing in the dark. 2:13 a.m. I had seen that hour before, on the concrete wall of my cell when I couldn't sleep, on the edge of a cot that held a man sobbing into his pillow, on the slow drip of time that refused to move any faster, no matter how tightly I closed my eyes. I closed them now, but sleep did not follow. When I did drift off, it wasn't restful. It never was. The dreams came in fragments, sheets of steel, flickering fluorescent light, the sour stench of sweat and disinfectant mixing in the air. I saw faces I hadn't seen in years. Some I couldn't name anymore. Others I couldn't forget if I tried. I saw myself younger, harder, eyes narrow with distrust, hands curled into fists without reason. I saw blood. Not much, just enough. A smear on a wall, a drop on a boot. A face looking up at me, confused, then gone. I woke with a start. My hand had gripped the edge of the thin blanket so tightly that the fabric had torn slightly beneath my fingers. My breath came in shallow gasps. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The ceiling above me was unfamiliar. The air wasn't thick with iron and sweat. No metal bars. No voice yelling count. Just that damned quiet. I sat up slowly, joints aching, the blanket sliding off my shoulders. I could feel sweat cooling against my back. I wiped my face with both hands and leaned forward, elbows on knees, letting the floor steady me. The laminate was cold beneath my bare feet, sticky in some places. I stared at the spot where the blanket had torn and told myself it was just fabric, just a reflex. Nothing more. On the small nightstand beside the bed sat the broken watch. I had placed it there as I always did, face up, even though it didn't tick. The time it showed had never changed since the day it stopped. 6:42. I didn't know why I kept it. Maybe because it had once belonged to my father. Maybe because, like me, it had outlived its function, but still held weight in the hand. I picked it up and held it for a while, the metal cool against my palm, the leather band stiff and cracking. There was comfort in the ritual, even if the meaning had faded long ago. I walked to the small bathroom attached to the room and splashed cold water on my face. The faucet squeaked when I turned it. The water was sharp, chlorinated, not unlike what I had known behind bars. I looked up into the mirror, half fogged by the humidity. My face was still there, still mine, but thinner, more hollow, a collection of lines and folds and sunken places. I ran a towel over my face and stood there, staring until the mirror cleared and forced me to meet my own eyes. The shadows didn't leave during the day. They just shifted. I went through the motions of reintegration, classes, paperwork, short supervised walks to the grocery store, but my mind was never fully present. I watched people laugh in the park and felt something tighten in my chest. Not envy, not sorrow, just the sharp realization that I didn't know how to join them. My laugh felt like a memory I couldn't access. My smile was a mechanical reflex that never quite reached the eyes. Sometimes I caught myself waiting for the count. That old call of a guard's voice through the corridor, the barked numbers, the shuffling to stand still at your bunk. I would be alone in the kitchenette, making coffee from a can, and suddenly stiffen at a sound outside, waiting, counting, obeying. But no one came. No voice, no footsteps, just the hum of the fridge and the slow drip of the faucet that no one had bothered to fix. I developed habits to fill the empty time. I folded my clothes with military precision, even though no one checked. I cleaned the small floor space with a rag and warm water, even though it was already clean. I aligned my toothbrush, comb, and shaving razor on the sink's edge, just as I had done for decades. It wasn't about control. It was about remembering who I was when no one else did. At night, I started writing in a small notebook, just words, fragments, pieces of thought that didn't belong anywhere else. I wrote about the dreams, about the cold silence, about the way I still walked with my shoulders slightly hunched, unconsciously protecting my ribs. I never shared the notebook. It was mine, the only place where I didn't have to explain the ghosts I carried. The shadows weren't just in my mind, they lived in my bones, in the way I flinched when someone walked too close, in the way I backed into corners so I could see the whole room, in the way I scanned exits before sitting down. They weren't paranoia. They were residue. They were a language my body still spoke fluently, even if the world had stopped using it. One morning, I woke before dawn. The sky outside was still black, tinged only slightly with the promise of light. I sat up and reached for the watch. Still dead. Still 6:42. I held it anyway. I sat there on the edge of the bed, clutching it in both hands, and let the silence press around me. The sun eventually rose, casting a sliver of gold across the floor. Dust floated in the air like breath turned visible. I watched it swirl and settle. I told myself I had survived. I told myself I was free. But freedom didn't come with a key or a door or a sentence served. It came slowly, if at all. And for now, the shadows were still louder than the light. The job wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with a uniform or a time card or even a clear description. I found it through a community bulletin board tacked with curling flyers, thumbtacks rusting at the edges. Part-time maintenance, City Park, mornings. A number scrawled in blue ink. I called it from the phone in the hallway at the halfway house, the receiver still warm from the last man's breath. A woman answered. She asked if I could start Monday. I said yes. That was it. Monday came with heavy clouds and a wind that carried the sour smell of damp earth and traffic. I wore the only clothes I had, an old gray sweatshirt, jeans that didn't quite fit, and the same sneakers issued to me the day I was released. They were too white, too new, and didn't match the rest of me. I stood outside the tool shed by 7:03 a.m. A man with a limp opened the door and handed me a broom without a word. I nodded and got to work. The park was a small square of grass and cracked pavement wedged between an elementary school and a low-income apartment complex. It had 3 benches, 1 jungle gym, and a single street lamp that flickered even in daylight. My first task was to sweep the concrete paths. Leaves had gathered in soft, rustling piles, curled at the edges like sleeping things. I began at the edge of the sidewalk and pushed the broom forward, slow and steady, watching the dust rise and dance in the wind. The motion was familiar, back and forth, back and forth. It reminded me of sweeping the tiers outside my cell block, of waiting for the line to move in the chow hall, of passing time by doing something repetitive, something small, something real. My hands remembered the weight of the broom before my mind did. The calluses on my palms thickened again over the first 2 weeks, soft skin hardening like bark. I found comfort in it. Each morning followed the same rhythm. I arrived before the sun crested the school's rooftop. The light would spill over slowly, gilding the jungle gym with gold before warming the benches. I swept, trimmed hedges, picked up litter, juice boxes, broken earbuds, cigarette butts. I replaced trash bags in the bins and wiped bird droppings from the metal swing seats. No one thanked me. No one noticed. That was fine. The air in the park had its own moods. Mornings smelled of dew and mulch. By mid-morning, exhaust from the nearby street crept in, mixing with the sugar-sweet scent of fallen crab apples rotting near the tree line. Children's voices rang out from the schoolyard across the fence, distant and chaotic, like birds startled from a tree. I listened, not to the words, but to the rise and fall of tone. Joy had its own language. One morning, I found a dead sparrow beneath the bench near the sandbox. It had no blood, no visible injury, just stillness. I picked it up gently with gloved hands and wrapped it in newspaper from the bottom of the bin. The obituary page, I realized as I folded it. The headline read, "A Life Remembered." It felt too perfect to be accidental. I buried the bird beneath the shrubs on the far side of the park, where no one walked. I didn't mark the spot. That kind of grief had to be quiet. On my 3rd week, I trimmed back the hedge along the chain-link fence. A piece of glass, jagged and half buried in the soil, sliced through my glove and nicked the skin at the base of my thumb. It stung, not from pain, but from recognition. That thin line of blood felt like a return. I cleaned the wound in the shed with rubbing alcohol and wrapped it in gauze I found in an old plastic bin marked Misk. The blood soaked through by noon. I didn't change it. I wanted to feel it. Just a little. People passed through the park, but rarely stopped. Teenagers cut across it with their heads down, thumbs working phones. Mothers pushed strollers, never meeting my eyes. Joggers moved to some internal rhythm I couldn't hear. Now and then, a child waved. I waved back. That was enough. Each day, I took a lunch break on the far bench, the one near the tree that dropped needles like confetti. I brought a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a bottle of water. I chewed slowly, watching ants scurry in the dirt near my boots. Once I dropped a crust and watched them descend like an army. Their purpose was clear. Mine was not. The watch I kept in my pocket didn't work. Still, I pulled it out each day at noon and pretended. I turned the hands manually to 12 and held it in my palm. The weight anchored me. It was a habit without function, but it filled something unnamed. I never missed a lunch. I never skipped a shift. I never arrived late. On Fridays, I swept the playground sand into even lines. I didn't have to. No one asked. But I liked the order of it. The way the rake made a soft sound, like waves pulling back from the shore. Once, a gust of wind undid my work before I'd even finished. I watched the lines disappear and started over without thought. It was the doing that mattered, not the lasting. Work gave my hands something to hold. In prison, they had often clenched out of instinct, curled into fists or tightened around plastic trays. Now they held rakes, bags, brushes. They moved with quiet purpose. They did not tremble as much. They did not harm. When my shift ended, I washed my hands in the public restroom. The soap smelled like lemon and rust. The mirror was scratched, the metal faucet sticky with old fingerprints. I scrubbed my nails clean, as I had done for 40 years, and dried my hands on paper towels that fell apart too easily. Before leaving, I always looked in the mirror, not to check my appearance, but to see if my face had changed. It hadn't. Not yet. By the time I walked back to the halfway house, the sun had moved far behind the buildings. My legs were tired. My back ached. My clothes clung to me with the weight of dust and sweat. But something in me felt still. Not peaceful. Not content. Just still. That was enough. Work had not forgiven me. Work had not absolved me. But it let me exist without explanation. And in a world where my name was a headline, my past a stain, that small mercy mattered more than anyone could know. There came a morning when I couldn't tie my shoe. My fingers, stiff from cold and age, trembled over the laces like they belonged to someone else. I sat on the edge of the bed for nearly 15 minutes, hunched over, trying to will the knot into place. My back complained. My knees groaned. I finally gave up and shoved my foot into the half-laced shoe, pressing the tongue down with the side of my palm. It held, just enough to walk. That single moment haunted me more than most of what had come before. In prison, pain was background noise. Sore muscles, bruised ribs, broken teeth. Those were just parts of the day. But that morning, the quiet ache in my fingers, the way the simple act of tying a knot became impossible, was a reminder that my body had turned against me slowly, without warning, and without dignity. My knees had always been bad. Too many years of standing on hard floors, of pacing concrete, of climbing steel stairs that echoed like old drums. But lately, the pain settled into my bones like an unwelcome tenant. I could feel the weather change before the weatherman said a word. Rain lived behind my kneecaps. Cold collected in my shoulder, the same one I dislocated breaking up a fight in the yard in '93. I started noticing other things too. My balance shifted. I caught myself placing one hand on the wall when I turned corners, as if bracing for a wave. My handwriting, already crude, began to spasm into something near illegible. A signature became a smudge. My reflection, once something I rarely looked at, became unavoidable. In the restroom mirror at the park, in the window glass of storefronts, there he was, an old man in a jacket too big, shoes scuffed, mouth often slightly open, as if perpetually about to speak but never finding the words. I had never thought about aging when I was inside. I had thought about time, sure, Time was all we had, but never aging. There, the body was something to defend, to discipline, to keep hard, like armor. I exercised daily, push-ups, sit-ups, squats, not for vanity, but for survival. Weakness invited attention. Softness was an invitation to be hurt. So I trained like I was going to war, even though the war was just the calendar. But after release, everything slowed. The body I had once trained like a machine began to resist me. My calves cramped at night. My breath grew shorter walking uphill. My skin bruised too easily, paper-thin and pale in the morning light. I found liver spots on my arms, one by one, like quiet warnings. The watch I carried in my pocket, still frozen at 6:42, began to feel less like a symbol and more like a cruel joke. Time had not stopped. It had marched on, and it had left deep footprints on my flesh. I found myself moving differently. I no longer walked with long strides. I shuffled, not from fear as I once had, but because my hips refused the old rhythm. My steps became careful, measured. I watched the ground, not because of who might be nearby, but because I feared the small betrayals of uneven pavement. A crack in the sidewalk could now send me sprawling, and no one looked kindly on old men who fell in public. Some days, I stared at my hands. They looked like my father's in the last years of his life, veins bulging, knuckles wide and raw. The skin was dry, no matter how much lotion I rubbed into it. My nails were yellowed and brittle. Once I cut one too short, and it bled for nearly an hour. I wrapped it in gauze and watched the red seep through the fabric like a slow confession. I began to forget small things, the names of streets, the order of numbers in a phone code, the day of the week. Not always, not dangerously, but enough. I covered for it with routines. I made lists on scrap paper, what to buy, where to go, what time to be back. I pinned the notes to the wall near my bed with a dull pushpin I'd kept from an old bulletin board. It helped, but not always. Sometimes I read a note and didn't recognize my own handwriting. It looked foreign, rushed, like a stranger had been living in my body. And then there were the smells. I noticed them more now. The sour tang of mildew in the shared shower at the halfway house, the sharp sweetness of cleaning bleach, the damp odor of rain soaked into cotton. My nose, it seemed, had grown more sensitive while everything else dulled. Some mornings I woke with the phantom scent of prison soap in my nostrils, a chemical lemon scent that never quite masked the rusted pipes. I knew it wasn't real, but I smelled it anyway, like my body was remembering what my mind tried to forget. One evening, after a long day sweeping the park, I dropped a glass of water. It slipped from my hand without warning and shattered against the tile. I stood there staring at it, the shards catching the fading light like pieces of ice. I didn't bend to pick them up right away. I just watched. The water soaked into the cuff of my pants. My socks grew damp, and I didn't move. For nearly 5 minutes I just stood there, feeling the defeat press into me like gravity. Eventually I knelt, slow and stiff, and gathered the pieces with a towel. One shard cut into my palm, small but sharp. The blood welled up, warm and bright. I pressed the towel against it and sat down at the kitchen table, hand-wrapped, eyes unfocused. The clock on the wall ticked behind me. That cheap plastic thing with bold black numbers and a ticking second hand that never stopped, unlike mine. Mine had stopped. This one marched forward without apology. I started keeping a small notebook again. This time, I didn't write about my thoughts. I wrote down the things I noticed in my body, the days my back ached, the mornings when my hands wouldn't close. I marked them like data points, like I could find a pattern. But there wasn't one. It was just slow erosion, a tide pulling pieces of me back, grain by grain. And yet, despite it all, I woke up each morning. I stretched, I stood, I dressed. slowly but completely. I walked to the park. I worked. I breathed. I endured. Not because I was strong, but because I didn't know what else to do. Time had already taken so much from me. My youth, my years, my body. I refused to give it the rest without resistance. So I walked. Slowly. I tied my shoes even when it hurt. I scraped calluses from my heels and trimmed my nails with trembling hands. I lifted the broom. I moved through the pain. I let the clock tick. Because this body was all I had left, and I intended to live in it for as long as it would let me, even if I no longer recognized the man I saw in the mirror, even if the mirror looked back with a stranger's eyes. The library became a refuge, not because I sought knowledge, but because I needed a place where silence was expected, not questioned. It was the only public space where people didn't look at you if you kept your head down, where solitude wasn't suspicious, where no one asked what you did before you arrived, or why your eyes kept drifting toward the exits. The building was old, tucked between a pharmacy and an insurance office on a quiet street 2 blocks from the park. Its bricks were weathered, sun-bleached in patches. A set of narrow steps led to double doors that creaked faintly every time they opened. Inside, the air was cool and still. Not air-conditioned, just still, like it had settled and learned not to move too quickly. It smelled of yellowing paper, binding glue, and something soft and sour. Maybe the carpet, maybe age itself. I walked past the front desk with a nod. The librarian, a woman with gray hair twisted into a knot, rarely looked up from her screen. Once, she handed me a library card application, and I filled it out using block letters. I had to ask for help with the address. The form asked for a phone number. I didn't have one. She skipped it. That was the end of our conversation. There was a table near the window on the 2nd floor, behind the stacks of philosophy books. That became my place. It was far enough from the entrance that no one passed by without a reason, and the light there was always soft, filtered through dust-covered blinds that rattled faintly when the windows were cracked. I liked that corner. The chair wobbled slightly, and the table had initials carved into its surface, WG+TL, SLO 94, and one set that was scratched out violently. I often traced those letters with my fingers while thinking, imagining the hands that had made them. At first, I pulled random books from the shelves, titles that sounded important, names I half remembered from overheard conversations or ancient headlines. I didn't read quickly. My eyes tired easily. I'd forgotten how to sit still for the sake of learning, not survival. But over time, I settled into a rhythm. I read one page at a time, then paused. Sometimes I reread the same sentence 5 times before moving on. There was no urgency. I began to gravitate toward books on ethics, on redemption, on punishment. Not out of guilt, at least not only, but out of curiosity. What did the world believe about men like me? What did the philosophers say about the weight of a single act versus a lifetime? I scribbled thoughts in a small notebook I carried in my coat pocket, writing with the same pen I'd used to sign my release papers. Black ink, slow handwriting. Sometimes just a sentence, sometimes a question I never answered. Can you be forgiven if you never ask? Is silence repentance? What if the man you were is not the man you are? These were the things that filled my hours. Other library patrons came and went. Students with earbuds, retirees reading newspapers, mothers reading aloud to their children. I observed them from the corner of my eye, careful not to stare. I watched how they moved, how they spoke in hushed tones, how their bodies belonged to the world in ways mine no longer did. I noticed the way their fingers skimmed book spines with ease, the way they laughed softly and whispered without fear. Once, I dropped a book. The thud echoed through the room like a gunshot. Heads turned. I froze. My breath caught. For a few seconds, I wasn't in a library. I was back in the yard, back in the hall, back in the cell. Then the moment passed. The librarian didn't scold me. A young man picked up the book and placed it on the table without a word. I nodded, but he was already gone. I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the cover. A book on moral responsibility. Fitting. I often stayed until closing. When the overhead lights dimmed slightly and the PA system crackled with reminders, I would pack my things slowly. I always returned my books to the shelf. It felt wrong to leave them behind. I tucked my chair in, aligned it with the table. Rituals mattered. They gave shape to the hours. Outside, the streetlights would be flickering to life, casting long, stretched shadows across the pavement. I liked walking home in the near dark, the wind cooler, the sidewalks empty. It felt like the world let me exist more freely at that hour. Fewer eyes, fewer voices, just the hush of evening and the rustle of leaves underfoot. One night I brought a book home with me, a battered copy of the Brothers Karamazov, its spine nearly split. I read 2 pages before bed, then fell asleep with the book open on my chest. When I woke, my hand was still resting on the page. I couldn't remember a word of what I'd read, but I remembered the weight of the book, the texture of the paper, the quiet. The library became a kind of sanctuary, not because it saved me, but because it asked nothing of me. It let me sit with my thoughts without interruption. It let me hide in plain sight. It gave me the illusion of being part of something without the demand of participation. And in that silence, surrounded by paper, by old chairs, by forgotten sentences and unanswered questions, I began to feel the faint outline of something I hadn't known I was missing. Not peace, not purpose, just the quiet permission to be. I never looked for the past. It had a habit of showing up on its own, uninvited, like a cold draft under a door you thought was sealed. It arrived in the faces of strangers, in the sudden whiff of an old cologne, in the sound of a voice that mimicked one I had tried to forget. The past had legs. It walked the same streets I did, and sometimes it looked me right in the eye. The first time it happened, I was standing in line at a convenience store. I had a pack of bread in one hand and a bottle of aspirin in the other. My joints had been barking louder than usual, and I was down to my last 2 pills. The man ahead of me paid in change, pennies hitting the counter one by one. When he turned to leave, his eyes caught mine. Just for a second, just a flicker. But in that instant, I saw it. Recognition, followed by something tighter, darker. His mouth pressed into a line. He didn't say a word, just stepped past me and out the door. I stood frozen, the aspirin bottle sweating in my hand. The cashier called for the next customer, and I stepped forward, but the air felt thick. On the walk back to the halfway house, I tried to place the man. I couldn't, but he knew me. That much was certain. He knew my face, maybe from the newspaper, maybe from before. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way his jaw clenched, the way he looked at me like I had no right to stand there in the cereal aisle, holding white bread like a regular man. Later that week, I passed a group of teenagers near the park. One of them was leaning against the bike rack, scrolling through a phone, earbuds dangling from his collar. The others laughed too loudly at something I didn't hear. As I walked past, one of them said my name, my full name, like he was testing the weight of it. I kept walking. My spine straightened. My breath held. But the name followed me like an echo down the sidewalk. I didn't turn around. I didn't give them the satisfaction. Some nights, I walked past places that used to be other things. A diner that had once been a laundromat. A school building now turned into condos. A barber shop that had kept the same striped pole but changed owners 5 times. The buildings changed, but my memory didn't. I remembered faces that had long since faded from the neighborhood, but they lived in my mind like old photographs curled at the edges. I saw Mrs. Lattimore once. She had been a teacher at the middle school I attended, back when I was 12 and still soft in the face. She was older now, hunched and slow, pushing a walker down the street near the pharmacy. I recognized her immediately. She didn't recognize me, or if she did, she gave no sign. I watched her shuffle past. Her hair was white now, her shoulders narrow under the weight of time. I thought about calling her name, just to see if it stirred something. But I stayed silent. That part of me didn't belong to her anymore. A few weeks later, I sat on a bench outside the library, resting my knees, when a woman with a grocery bag walked past and stopped mid-step. Her eyes narrowed. I recognized the gesture before I recognized the face. Her name came to me slowly, Gina Markham. She had been the sister of someone I knew once, someone I had shared a cell block with for a short time before he was transferred. I hadn't seen her in over 30 years, but there was no mistaking the jawline, the freckle beneath her left eye. She stared. I nodded. That was all. No words, just a nod, like acknowledging weather. She didn't return it. She looked me over like she was assessing a threat, then turned and walked away, her shoes clicking on the pavement like typewriter keys. I sat there long after she disappeared, hands folded in my lap, watch in my pocket, ticking silence. It wasn't always people. Sometimes it was objects, smells, sounds. Once I picked up a paperback from the free shelf at the library, only to find an inscription on the inside cover in a familiar scrawl. A name I hadn't heard in decades. A man I knew from inside. Gone now. Dead, probably. I closed the book and put it back on the shelf without checking it out. Another time, I passed an alley and smelled turpentine, and I was instantly back in the prison workshop, where we stripped old furniture and refinished it for resale. The scent clung to your clothes for days. I stood there, in that alley, and breathed it in until it made me dizzy. Then I walked away. Once I found myself standing outside a house I didn't remember walking to. It took me a full minute to realize where I was. The house belonged to the family of the man I had killed, or it had once. The curtains were different. A new car sat in the driveway. A child's bike leaned against the garage. I stood across the street, hands in my pockets, heart pounding like it wanted out of my chest. I didn't approach. I didn't even blink. I just stood there until the porch light flicked on, and then I turned and walked away. That night I sat in bed, holding the broken watch. I turned the hands slowly, setting them to 6:42 as always, even though I knew it was closer to midnight. My fingers trembled, my vision blurred. But I didn't cry. I never did. I just sat with the weight of it all. The names, the faces, the knowing glances, the silence of people who remembered, and the noise of a world that didn't. The past didn't knock. It slid in under the door. It waited behind your breath. It smiled from across the street and disappeared before you could be sure it was ever there. I never asked for it to visit, but it came anyway. I had learned long ago that silence was currency. In prison, it bought you distance. It bought you protection. It bought you time. Men who talked too much often found themselves with broken ribs or worse. The quiet ones survived. The ones who kept their eyes low, their mouths closed, their hands busy. I became one of them not because I was afraid, but because silence suited me. It felt cleaner, more honest. Words could lie. Silence only revealed what others chose to project onto it. But out here, in the free world, silence didn't work the same way. It didn't buy me anything. It only built walls I didn't know how to take down. At the halfway house, other men gathered around the kitchen table after dinner. They talked about jobs, about girlfriends they hoped to win back, about football games they half remembered watching before the years swallowed them. I listened without joining. I stirred my coffee and stared at the wall. My voice, once something I guarded like a secret, had become a stranger to me. Even when someone spoke directly to me, asked how I was, where I'd worked before, what I planned to do next. I answered with as few words as possible. My replies felt clumsy, like shoes too big for my feet. I didn't know how to explain 40 years in a few sentences. I didn't know how to offer my story without the weight of it pressing down on the listener, like wet cement. One of the counselors noticed. He handed me a form after one of our weekly check-ins. It was for a group therapy circle, recommended, but not mandatory. I folded the paper and stuffed it into my coat pocket. I never went. I wasn't afraid of speaking. I just didn't see the use. What could I say that hadn't already been said in a courtroom, in newspaper headlines, in the eyes of people who crossed the street when they recognized my name? I had spoken once, all those years ago, during the trial. Said what I had to say. The rest I had buried. But silence had a weight too. It pressed into my chest some mornings before I even opened my eyes. It followed me through the park, into the library, around the grocery store where the cashier never asked if I needed a bag. It sat beside me at night like a second shadow, invisible but solid. And it cost me things I hadn't expected. It cost me connection, a chance at small kindnesses. A smile returned, a nod from someone who might have otherwise seen me as a person instead of a figure in the periphery. It cost me the ability to say simple things. I found myself avoiding situations where conversation might be required. I didn't ask for help even when I needed it. I walked home in the rain instead of asking to borrow an umbrella. I ate the same canned soup 3 days in a row because I didn't want to speak to the clerk at the corner store. Even my body had grown quiet. I coughed less, laughed less. My breath came shallow. My footsteps softened. I moved like I didn't want to wake the world. I remembered my mother's voice. Soft, always. She used to hum while she cooked. Sometimes hymns, sometimes songs without words. After she died, the house fell silent. My father had spoken in short bursts, commands mostly. His silence was a weapon. Mine had become a habit. At night I lay in bed and turned the old watch over in my hand. It had long since stopped keeping time, but I still carried it, still wound it as if it might suddenly start again. The quiet tick that never came was a reminder of all the things I hadn't said. Apologies, explanations, even anger. I sometimes whispered into the dark. Not prayers, not pleas, just pieces of thought, broken and scattered like pebbles dropped down a well. There was no one to hear them. But I said them anyway, in a voice raspy from disuse. I said the names of people I remembered. I said words I hadn't said in decades. Words like forgive, sorry, enough. I didn't know who they were for. Maybe myself. One afternoon, a woman at the park dropped her keys. She was juggling a toddler on one hip and a grocery bag in the other. The keys clattered on the sidewalk and rolled beneath the bench. I stepped forward, picked them up, and handed them to her. She thanked me, breathless and grateful. I nodded. That was all. I nodded. I walked away and realized I hadn't said a single word, even when the moment called for it, even when I had something simple, kind, and decent to offer. The silence wasn't protection anymore. It was a cage I hadn't noticed building around me until the door had closed. In the library, I read a line from a book that stayed with me. It said, "A man becomes a ghost, not when he dies, but when no one hears his voice." I copied it into my notebook and underlined it twice. That night, I sat in the shared kitchen with 2 other men. One of them was talking about his daughter. The other nodded and laughed. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the edge of the table. I didn't speak, but I stayed. And that, in its own way, was something. Silence had cost me. But maybe slowly, I could learn how to spend my words again. Carefully, deliberately. Like a man learning to walk after forgetting how. Not because I wanted redemption. Not because I expected to be understood. But because even a whisper carries weight when it hasn't been heard in years. The cemetery was quiet in a way the world rarely allowed anymore. There were no cars passing nearby, no sirens, no phones ringing. Just the soft murmur of leaves rustling in the wind and the occasional caw of a crow from the branches above. I hadn't come with a plan. I'd gotten off the bus 3 stops too early and walked without thinking, and somehow my feet brought me here. The gates were black wrought iron, old and leaning slightly inward, as if the dead were pulling them close. I passed through and stepped onto the gravel path, the crunch beneath my shoes breaking the stillness in small, deliberate rhythms. My hands stayed in the pockets of my coat, and my breath came slow. The air smelled of damp soil, trimmed grass, and stone warmed by the sun. There was comfort in cemeteries, not in death, but in the fact that no one expected you to speak. The dead didn't care what you'd done or hadn't done. They didn't flinch when they recognized your name. They didn't ask questions or offer rehearsed sympathy. They simply stayed where they were, quiet and certain. I wandered between rows of headstones, some newer, with polished granite faces and crisp engravings, others weathered and crumbling, names half erased by rain and time. I paused now and then to read them. Beloved father, devoted wife, gone too soon. The words didn't change much, only the dates did. One stone caught my attention, not because of the name, though it was familiar, but because of the chipped corner and the way moss had crept into the lettering. I knelt slowly, knees complaining as I lowered myself down, and brushed away the dirt with my sleeve. The name belonged to a man I'd known briefly inside. He'd been older than me, already ill when he arrived. He never made it out. His epitaph read, "He did the best he could." That was it. No mention of family, of service, of love. Just that sentence. I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if it was an excuse or an offering. Further down, I found the children's section. Smaller stones, more toys, wind chimes hung from thin branches. A stuffed bear, damp and sagging, sat beneath one grave marked with a rainbow and a name I couldn't read. I didn't stay there long. The grief in that corner felt louder. Eventually, I came to the older part of the cemetery, where the grass was longer and the stones leaned at odd angles. Here, the silence deepened. I stopped in front of a tall, gray slab, split down the center. There was no name, just a cross, and below it, the faint outline of words I couldn't make out. I ran my fingers over the grooves, feeling the indentations like braille. It struck me then how fragile memory really was. You live a life, decades of breath and mistakes and choices and small moments that feel enormous when you're in them, and then you become a line on a stone. Sometimes not even that, just a shape weathered down by rain and years. I sat on the grass beside that stone and pulled the broken watch from my pocket. I set it on the ground, face up, hands still frozen at 6:42. I didn't know why I carried it with me today. Maybe because I needed to remember something steady. Maybe because I wanted to leave it behind. The sun passed behind a cloud, and the light softened. I rested my back against another stone behind me and looked up at the sky. It was pale blue, almost washed out, with a single plane cutting a thin line through the clouds like a thread unraveling from an old sweater. I thought about my own name, Samuel Hutchins. I imagined it carved into granite, letters deep and black. What would they write beneath it? I tried to picture the phrases, convicted, released, forgotten. He kept to himself. One mistake, a lifetime's shadow. None of them sat right. None of them felt like the truth. But maybe truth didn't belong on stone. Maybe stone was only for what people wanted to believe after you were gone. I once read that Roman tombs used to have messages carved into them that spoke directly to the passerby. Traveler, stop and read. What you are, I once was. What I am, you will be. There was something honest in that. Not sentimental, just clear. A reminder that we're all heading toward the same silence, and all we can leave behind are the echoes of how we carried ourselves on the way there. I didn't fear dying. I feared being misunderstood, being remembered wrong, or worse, not remembered at all. I stood slowly, brushing off my pants. My knees crackled like old paper. I picked up the watch again and held it in my palm, thumb grazing the edge of the crystal face. I looked down at the blank stone and wondered if someone had meant to add a name, or if it had always been left that way. Empty, anonymous, a monument to everyone and no one. Before I left, I took a pencil from my coat and scribbled a note on the back of an old receipt I'd kept in my wallet. I placed it beneath a loose rock at the base of the nameless stone. The words weren't poetic. They weren't even legible to anyone who didn't know my handwriting. But they were mine. It simply said, I was here. I changed. That should count for something. As I walked back toward the gate, the gravel crunched under my feet in the same slow rhythm. I didn't look back. The past was behind me, etched into more than just stone. But something about leaving that message, that quiet truth, made the silence feel less heavy. The wind picked up as I stepped onto the street. The world moved on, but for a little while I had spoken, even if no one would ever read it. I started the letter on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting by the small window in my room with the curtain pulled halfway to cut the glare. The air was dry, still holding on to the last traces of autumn. I could smell dust rising from the radiator and the faint tang of rusted metal from the window frame. Outside, someone was mowing a patch of grass that didn't need it, and the scent of chopped weeds floated through the screen. I didn't know how to begin, so I wrote my name at the top, Samuel Hutchins. Seeing it in my own handwriting did something to me. It reminded me that I still existed outside court documents, outside mugshots and files with red stamps. It reminded me that I was still here, even if most days I didn't feel entirely present. I sat for several minutes with the pen resting against the page, tapping gently, as if rhythm could summon clarity. The notebook I was using had a soft cover, the kind they gave away in group therapy. I never stayed long in those sessions, but I always took the supplies. Free paper was still a kind of gift, no matter where it came from. The pen bled slightly when I pressed too hard. I liked that. Ink had a way of looking permanent even when your thoughts were not. I wrote slowly. You were not always this man. That was the first sentence that made it past my hand. It hovered on the page, like a truth I didn't want to look at directly. I let it sit there, alone, and drank from a chipped mug of black coffee that had gone cold. The bitterness filled my mouth. I didn't mind. I'd long since stopped needing comfort in taste. I wrote another line. There was a boy once, barefoot in the backyard, laughing as he climbed the peach tree your father planted. He is still somewhere in you, bruised but breathing. I didn't know why I chose that memory. Maybe because it was untainted. Maybe because that tree had disappeared long before I went away, and writing it down made it real again for a moment. I remembered the bark beneath my palms, the stickiness of sap on my shirt, the warm burst of fruit against my teeth. I hadn't thought about it in years. The letter continued in fragments. I didn't follow a structure. I wasn't writing for a reader. I was writing to see if I still had something inside worth speaking to. You did not know then what a moment could cost. You did not know how long 1 hour could echo. I paused again. My wrist ached. The joints in my fingers had begun to stiffen with the cold. I set the pen down and flexed my hand. The watch sat on the desk beside me, still frozen at 6:42. I turned it over. The back was scuffed from years of carrying it in my pocket. I considered placing it on the page, as if its weight could anchor my words. I picked the pen back up. You hurt people. You hurt yourself. You carried that hurt like a second skin, and some days it was the only thing that reminded you you were alive. I didn't cry while writing. That wasn't how emotion came to me. It came as tightness in my throat, as the way my jaw locked without me noticing, as a tremor in my left hand that made the lines go crooked. I didn't try to fix it. The page had to hold all of it, even the flaws. The letter wasn't an apology, not in the way people expect one. It wasn't an excuse either. It was an attempt to make sense of something senseless, to talk to the version of myself that still haunted my sleep. The man who stood in that courtroom and didn't flinch. The man who spent nights staring at the ceiling, counting cracks instead of years. I wrote about the silence, about how it had become a part of me, how I carried it like a shadow that never changed with the sun. I wrote about the mornings I didn't want to wake, and the nights I feared sleep. I wrote about the people who had disappeared from my life without needing to be asked, and the ones who had stayed too long. I tore out one page halfway through writing it. The words came out angry, blaming, not at others, but at myself. I didn't want to give that version of me the final word. I folded the torn paper carefully and burned it in an old coffee tin I kept under the sink. The smoke smelled sharp, and the edges curled into black petals before falling to ash. When I returned to the notebook, I wrote something softer. You have learned the shape of regret. You know now that it doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. I filled 7 pages. No dates. No Dear Sam. Just a trail of words that felt more like breath than language. I wasn't trying to make peace. I was trying to make space. For doubt. For memory. For something like understanding. The final line came unannounced. If no one else ever forgives you, learn to walk beside that truth without letting it consume you. I put the pen down. The room had grown darker. The sun had slipped behind the buildings across the street, and the radiator ticked in its uneven rhythm. I folded the letter once, then twice, and slid it into the middle of the notebook, pressing it closed with both hands. I didn't intend to mail it. There was no address, but something about sealing it that way made it feel finished, even if the work wasn't. That night, I placed the notebook beside my bed, next to the watch, both silent, both broken in their own way, but still here, still waiting to be opened again. I sat on the park bench just before dusk, the wood warm from the day's sun, my hands folded loosely over my knees. The air had shifted into that particular stillness that comes only at the end of long afternoons, when shadows grow longer and the light begins to soften, like worn fabric. The leaves rustled overhead, a dry whisper that carried the scent of earth and the faint sweetness of clover. A breeze passed through, and I felt it move across my cheeks like a breath from another time. This had become a ritual. I came to the same bench most evenings, just off the path near the pond where geese sometimes lingered, squawking and territorial. A cracked asphalt trail circled the water, but few people walked it in the evenings. The quiet suited me. In silence, I could observe without being observed. I could think without the need to explain what was happening behind my eyes. I watched a child skip stones from the opposite bank. His father stood a few feet away, hands in pockets, nodding occasionally, offering encouragement without words. The boy threw awkwardly, each stone splashing more than skipping. Still he grinned. He didn't need success to feel joy. I envied that. Not the innocence. I had long made peace with its absence, but the ease of being unburdened. The broken watch in my pocket pressed gently against my thigh. I pulled it out and held it in my palm. It remained as it always had, frozen at 6:42, the glass face scratched, the second hand immobile. I no longer tried to wind it. I simply carried it, a small metal anchor in a world that no longer needed my name. It had stopped working the day I was sentenced, and now, so many years later, I wasn't sure which of us had aged more. A dog barked in the distance, and a cyclist rode by with a flashing red light clipped to his backpack. I leaned back and looked up at the sky. The clouds were streaked with orange and lavender, and high above, a single plane cut silently through the fading blue. I imagined the people inside, watching movies, reading magazines, sipping ginger ale. None of them knew that below them sat an old man who had outlived his own reputation. I had spent years waiting for someone to forgive me. A judge, a stranger, a face from the past. But as the days passed, I began to understand that no voice would ever say those words aloud. Not to me. And even if they did, I wasn't sure I could receive them. Forgiveness, I'd learned, was not something you earned. It wasn't something you demanded. It was something that might arrive quietly in the night. Or not at all. And if it came, you might not recognize it until it was already gone again. The question that followed me now was simpler. Not, do they forgive me? Not even, can I forgive myself? But, can a man live a full life after doing the unforgivable, knowing he carries a weight that no apology can lift? It wasn't a question I expected an answer to. It was the kind of question you asked only when the world went quiet. The kind that hung between your ribs and echoed against bone. I shifted on the bench and looked down at my shoes. One lace was coming undone. I leaned forward slowly, carefully, my back aching as I tied it, looping the knot twice so it wouldn't come loose again. Small tasks meant something to me now. A neat shoelace, a straight edge on a folded towel, a rinsed cup in the sink. These were the things I could control. The rest was out of my hands. Behind me, a couple passed by, speaking softly, their arms brushing as they walked. I caught fragments of conversation, something about dinner plans, about the time, about forgetting to call someone. I didn't turn. Their voices drifted away as quickly as they had come. I thought about my name carved in stone someday, what it might say. I doubted there would be much. Maybe no one would mark it at all. Maybe the city would cremate me and scatter my ashes without ceremony. That possibility didn't scare me. I had never expected to leave a legacy. But part of me still wished for something more than absence. A trace. A sentence carved not in stone, but in memory. He changed. That would be enough. Not absolution. Not redemption. Just the acknowledgement that I had not remained the man I once was. I watched the sky grow darker. The color leached slowly from the grass, and the pond turned a deep shade of pewter. Lights clicked on along the path, buzzing faintly. The geese were gone now, the boy too. Only the bench and the wind remained. And me. I placed the watch back into my pocket and rested both hands on the bench's edge. The wood beneath my palms felt worn, smooth, like it had been touched by 1,000 others before me. People who had also come here with questions, with grief, with hope they were afraid to name. The final question still lingered. Can a monster be forgiven if he no longer sees himself as one, but remembers every reason why the world did? I had no answer, but I had breath. I had time, however little of it remained. I had this evening, this bench, this quiet, this body, worn but still willing. And so I sat there as night descended, not asking the world for mercy, only for the chance to keep asking.